Hello, United in Recovery family. It's Matt. I'm a follower of Jesus Christ and a grateful recovering alcoholic, and I'm humbled to have the opportunity to bring this week's recovery message. We're in the series Back to Basics, and in week 1, Will covered step 1, where we admit that we're powerless and that our lives are unmanageable. Last week, Brooke took us through step 2, where we come to believe that a power greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity. Brooke shared the verse from 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7, which establishes that our power is from God and not from ourselves. This week we're on step 3, where we make a decision to turn our will and life over to God. I feel like I've given this message a number of times, and since the series is Back to Basics, I want to make sure that we cover the basics. If you're in your first time working step 3, there are 2 critical resources that you must, and I repeat, must utilize. The first is the 12 and 12, the chapter on step 3, pages 34 through 41. That first paragraph is some of the most powerful language in all our literature, as it describes the key, and that key is willingness. Then there's the third step prayer, also from the big book, page 84. This prayer is a perfect way to actively work step 3. I love the language where we ask God to relieve us of the bondage of self. No message on step 3, Back to Basics, would be complete or even started without referencing those 2 critical recovery resources. There are some good messages in our message archive if you want to drill down further on those 2 resources. But in the time we have left tonight, I want to address another one of the basics that we often struggle with when working step 3. How many of us have asked or been asked by our sponsees, how can we know the difference between God's will and our self-will? The 4 absolutes provide a simple, straightforward way to evaluate whether our thoughts, words, or actions are self-centered or God-centered. Now, before we get into the 4 absolutes, let's talk a little bit about their history and where they came from. The 4 absolutes were initially written in 1904 by a Christian author, Robert Speer, and later would become part of the teachings of the Oxford Group, a movement started by Frank Buckman, a minister from Allentown, Pennsylvania in 1921. One common misunderstanding about the Oxford Group is that it was early AA. While that's not exactly true, but what is true about the Oxford Group is that the co-founders of AA met through the Oxford Group in 1935, and they codified many of the Oxford Group's tenets into the first AA program. Now, while the 4 absolutes were not explicitly part of the AA literature, Dr. Bob recalled that in 1948, that the absolutes were the only yardsticks that AA had in its early years, and that he and the founders measured any critical or difficult decisions against the absolutes. I could spend the rest of the night talking about the origin of the absolutes, but I think it's more important to spend the time that we have left talking about how we can apply them and giving you some tools that you can add to your recovery toolbox. The 4 absolutes are absolute honesty, absolute unselfishness, absolute purity, and absolute love. Pretty simple, right? Well, as the great jazz musician Thelonious Monk said, simple ain't easy. So how do we put these into application? Let's say you're faced with a difficult decision, or maybe you're considering how to respond to a conflict or a difficult situation that you're facing with a loved one or friend. Whatever the situation or question may be, apply the following test. For absolute honesty, ask yourself, is this action or inaction true or false? Am I hiding any bad motives under good ones in this? Is there anything secretive about this? Am I being dishonest about something in this decision or thought, either literally or spiritually? And that's just the test for honesty. For absolute purity, we ask ourselves, is this action or inaction good or bad? Is this action or inaction right or wrong? Am I trying to control something or avoid something that I shouldn't be trying to control or avoid? Am I in any way placing my sobriety at risk? For absolute unselfishness, we first must completely remove ourselves and, more importantly, our own self-interest from the equation and ask, how will this action or inaction affect others? Who will be hurt if I choose A and not B, or vice versa? Do I have a sense of entitlement or at work in any of this decision or thought process? And finally, for absolute love, we ask, is this action or inaction ugly, or is it beautiful? Is this action or inaction based in faith or based in fear? Notice in every instance I've specified action or inaction, and I think we need to be intentional and recognize that it's often our decision not to act that in fact that is an action that we take in response to certain situations. I know I've thrown a lot at you in a very short time, so I've copied a simple worksheet that you can add to your toolbox to help you apply these four absolutes when you're faced with discerning whether your self-will is aligned to God's will for your life. Tonight's scripture is from Romans chapter 12, verse 1, and is also the biblical comparison to step 3. Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's great mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Applying these four absolutes to discern what God's will for our life is, that's how we offer our bodies as living sacrifices. So as we move to group, maybe you want to share some area of your life where you've struggled or are struggling to discern between self-will and God's will. Maybe if you're like me, you just need to work on applying the four absolutes to your life as a whole and talk about where we need to be more honest, more pure, more unselfish, and more loving. Whatever you take into group with you tonight, know that you're in a safe place and that you'll be met there by a loving and merciful God. Hey, thanks for listening, and I hope to see you soon.